Caffeine will increase dopamine to some extent, but it is pretty modest compared to the other things that I described: chocolate, sex, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamine, and so on. However, there's a really interesting paper published in 2015. This is Volkow et al. You can look it up. It's very easy to find. That showed that regular ingestion of caffeine, whether or not it's from coffee or otherwise, increases upregulation of certain dopamine receptors. So caffeine actually makes you able to experience more of dopamine's effects. Because as I mentioned before, dopamine is vomited out into the synapse or it's released volumetrically, but then it has to bind someplace and trigger those G protein coupled receptors. And caffeine increases the number, the density of those G protein coupled receptors. Now, sitting back and thinking about that, you might think, oh yeah, sometimes I'll notice people, at least in the old days, that it used to be a cigarette and a cup of coffee. Or when people drink alcohol, oftentimes they'll smoke. And it's well known that different compounds like alcohol and nicotine, or caffeine and nicotine, or certain behaviors and certain drugs can synergize to give bigger dopamine increases. And this is not terribly uncommon. There are a lot of people nowadays who, for instance, take pre-workout energy drinks. They'll drink I won't name names, but they'll drink a canned energy drink, or they'll drink a pre-workout, and they'll try and get that big stimulation, that stimulant effect for the dopamine, the norepinephrine, that family of molecules that works together to make you motivated. And then they'll also exercise to try and get even more of a dopaminergic experience out of that workout. Sometimes it's also to perform better as well, of course. But as we'll talk about in a few minutes, that aspect, or that approach rather, of trying to just get your dopamine as high as you possibly can in order to get the most out of an experience, turns out to not be the best approach. And what you'll find as we talk about dopamine schedules is that layering together multiple things, substances and activities that lead to big increases in dopamine actually can create pretty severe issues with motivation and energy right after those experiences, and even a couple days later. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't take the occasional pre-workout if that's your thing, or drink a cup of coffee or two before working out now and again. Some people really enjoy that. I certainly do that every once in a while. But if you do it too often, what you'll find is that your capacity to release dopamine and your level of motivation and drive and energy overall will take a serious hit. Ingestion of caffeine is somewhat of an exception among the other examples of things I've mentioned to avoid before what would otherwise be dopamine-increasing activities, because, again, caffeine can increase the density and the efficacy of these dopamine receptors. It turns out that the source of caffeine could also matter. While coffee or tea or other forms of caffeine will have this effect of increasing dopamine receptors, yerba mate, something I've talked about before on this podcast, has some interesting properties. First of all, it contains caffeine. It's also high in antioxidants. It also contains something called GLP-1, which is favorable for management of blood sugar levels. Yerba mate, it turns out, has also been shown to be neuroprotective specifically for dopaminergic neurons. Now, I should mention this is just a couple of studies, so we don't want to conclude too much from these studies. More needs to be done. But they showed that in a model of damage to dopamine neurons, ingestion of yerba mate and some of the compounds within yerba mate can actually serve to preserve the survival of dopamine neurons in both the movement-related pathway and the motivation pathway. So perhaps you need that incentive in order to ingest yerba mate tea. Perhaps you don't need any incentive. In my case, I don't need any incentive. I already enjoy yerba mate as my principal source of caffeine, although I do drink coffee as well. But if one were going to consume caffeine, you might consider consuming that caffeine in the form of yerba mate, both for sake of upregulating dopamine receptors and getting more of a dopamine increase, and of course for the stimulant properties of caffeine, if that's what you're seeking. And in addition to that, because yerba mate does appear to have some sort of neuroprotective and in particular dopamine neuron protective properties.